Hello everyone. Today I'm going to introduce some key concepts in sociolinguistics so that you have the right terminology to use so that you can discuss sociolinguistics with some precision. As you'd guess from the name sociolinguistics, we've got social, people, right? People in interaction make a society, and linguistics, right? The study of language. So in sociolinguistics, we're studying the interaction between social groups of people and language. And the key concept the key word to remember is variation. Sociolinguistics is the study of variation. We'll come back to it as time goes on, but there are three things I like to think about when I think about sociolinguistics, three questions to do with variation. The first question is to describe what someone is doing differently from other people when they use language. So as you listen to me talk, you may notice that I sound different than people in Britain, for example. So I say things like can't, where a British person might say can't. And so so question one, what's different? My pronunciation of C-A-N''T. The second question to ask is, why is it different? Well, in this case, the answer is pretty obvious. Why do I say can't instead of can't? Because I was raised in Canada. I learned English in Canada. I learned English from the people around me who were, for the most part, speakers of Canadian English. And so I say can't like they did, right? So what's different? My pronunciation. Why is it different? Because I learned English in Canada. And question three, this is the most complex question though. What does it mean, right? How does it affect me? How does it affect others' judgment of me when they hear my Canadian pronunciation of can't? And of course, all the other things that I do when I use language. This question can be a lot more complex, right? It's pretty easy to hear the difference, can't. It's pretty easy to say why, he's Canadian. What does it mean is much more complex because, well, in my case, so I'm Canadian, but I live in Britain, and I've lived in Britain for 15 years almost. What does it mean? Well, when people hear my accent, it's generally, for me, a good thing. People will say, oh, I have, oh, are you Canadian? And they'll say, I like the Canadian accent, or they'll say, oh, I can tell you're Canadian from your accent. I've been to Vancouver, or they'll say, Canadian accent, oh, I've got cousins who live in Toronto. And generally, a Canadian accent is seen as a good thing here and leads to good results with people. And at most, sometimes people will tease me a bit. They'll say, oh, you guys speak funny English in the colonies or something. But I've never found it to be mean-spirited. It's just friends joking around or good-natured strangers, right? So what's different? Can't versus can't. Why is it different from Canada? What does it mean? Well, for me, it's generally a good thing. But of course, you could have the same first two steps, different pronunciation because you were born in a different place, and it could lead, for question three, what does it mean? It could lead to quite different circumstances and a quite different reaction. People from other countries who speak English fluently report that they often receive negative judgments of their accents, right? People from various countries say that, and we'll talk more about which countries in the future, of course, but people say that they're told their accent doesn't sound nice. Why don't you speak English properly? Why don't you sound British? You've lived here 10 years. Nobody expects me to sound British after having lived here for 10 years because they seem to accept that while my accent is different, that it's a correct one in some ways. Whereas other people, their accent is judged as incorrect no matter how fluently they speak English, no matter how long they've lived here. They're expected to change the way they speak. So that's what I mean by the question three, what does it mean, being a lot more complex of a question than the first two. So keep those in mind, right? We're talking about variation, difference. what does it mean? No, sorry. We're talking about what's different, why is it different, what does it mean? Now, when it comes to talking about variation, it's important, maybe obvious, but it's a good term to know. We're talking about internal variation. Internal variation within one language. In our case, I'm talking about English. We're talking about differences within the English language and the English language alone. We're not talking about external variation, differences between English and French. That would be some sort of contrastive analysis of languages. How does the grammar differ, what have you, between languages? We're talking about differences within one language, internal variation. And we're talking about in these different types of English, Canadian English, as I said, British English, American English, Australian English, and so on, the ones that people tend to think of as major types of English. But don't forget there are also types of English like New Zealand English, Scottish English, Irish English, and then there's those ones that people don't often think of until they're prompted a bit, but there are countries like Nigeria and India where there are millions of speakers of English, some and many of whom are native speakers of English, and also highly fluent, perfectly balanced bilinguals who use English, and then lots of people who use English at varying levels, right? So we can talk about Nigerian Englishes and Indian Englishes and Singaporean English, right? Lots of different types of English, and we call these varieties, right? So when we talk about language variation, we'll talk about language varieties, and often it's done at a national level: Canadian English, Nigerian English, Singaporean English, and so on. We can break that down more and talk about smaller types of variety later, but for now, just think of that, right? That we've got varieties of English. Often we describe them at the national level: Scottish English, Irish English, and so on. And we say what's different between them, why are they different, and what does it mean? You may sometimes hear, instead of variety, people use the word dialect to mean a dialect, to mean all of those features that make one type of English, one variety of English, different from another. In linguistics and sociolinguistics particularly, we tend to avoid using the word dialect, mostly just because it's got negative connotations. If you look in a typical, if you do a newspaper search, for example, go to the Telegraph or the Guardian or any newspaper and search for the word dialect, you'll tend to find that dialect is used in a way that signals that it's seen as a lesser form of English. The people use it to talk about lower class dialects or country dialects or uneducated dialects. And it's always associated with marginalized groups or has negative connotations. But for linguists, there's no difference between varieties of English in terms of their communicative function. But we know, of course, that I said with question number 3, we know they can be judged differently. The what does it mean question. We know they can be judged differently depending on who's talking. So because dialect often has those negative connotations, and we want to avoid that, we want to talk about these in a neutral way, we use the word variety, right? So we've got variation, we've got language varieties, and we're talking about that internal variation in English, the differences between different varieties of English. If you wanted, you could go right down and talk about individual types of English, right? Each person has his or her own idiolect, their own very particular way that they speak and no one else speaks. We don't want that level of detail, right? That's too much detail to talk about one individual person. And we don't want to talk about English as a whole, just talk about English. Sociolinguistics is aimed in between those two ends, looking somewhere in the middle at groups of people who use English in a similar way to one another, but different from other groups of English speakers. The way that we know that languages are varieties, the way that we know that different types of English are varieties of English and not entirely different languages is based on the principle of mutual intelligibility, meaning that speakers of American English and British English, to name two big ones, certainly there are recognizable differences between those two varieties of English, but they are similar enough that the two are mutually intelligible. British people speaking to Americans can generally understand each other. There may be problems at first in understanding a new accent of English. There may be some words that you don't understand when you hear a new type of English, but generally things are similar enough that they are mutually intelligible. That's how we say that if those two groups of people speak a language that is similar enough to each other, they call it one language with multiple, two or more varieties. This is sometimes complicated by political decisions, right? There are some times where for linguists, we see the same language, but for political reasons, the speakers of that language say that they speak two different languages. There was the former country of Yugoslavia, and back when it existed, the speakers were said to speak Serbo-Croatian. After the country dissolved in the early 1990s, the speakers of that language, if they were from Croatia, would say they speak Croatian. The speakers of Serbian from Serbia would say we speak Serbian. So for political reasons, two different countries, they referred to themselves as having two different languages. And there are some differences, of course, but largely for linguists, they are mutually intelligible, and therefore they are just different varieties of the same language. Although they do use a different writing system, they use a different, one uses Cyrillic and one uses Roman script. They are largely the same language. Other times the opposite happens, where languages that are quite distinct are referred to as one language. For example, in the case of China, the Chinese government refers to the language of Chinese for the most part and doesn't distinguish between different languages like Mandarin and Cantonese and Hakka and Hokkien and so on, which will sometimes be referred to by the Chinese government as dialects, but by linguists are referred to as different languages because they are often completely mutually unintelligible. They may use the same writing system of Chinese characters that you are probably familiar with, but when it comes to spoken interaction, the people cannot understand each other. So it's as if we said that, well, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish are all the same language because they all use the same letters. But we don't think that's true, right? We're focusing on the spoken language and not thinking about what letters they use or what characters they use to represent that language. So different varieties of English are not different languages because they are mutually intelligible. We don't call them dialects because of the negative connotations of that term, so we tend to just use the term varieties of English. The next major point is to talk about the types of variation, right? So I'm saying that there are differences between British English and Canadian English, differences between Nigerian English and Singaporean English, that I'm saying the people could largely understand each other, especially after they've had a bit of chance to get accustomed to the way one another speak, right? What are the differences that we should be looking for, right? My question one was, what are the differences? There are 4 types of differences. Aren't you glad I said 4 to make it clear that 4, of course you know what 4 is, right? There are 4 types of variation that you should be thinking of. The first one I've already alluded to, although not mentioned directly, right? The difference in sound, right? The difference between the way I say can't and other people say can't, and so on. This is called phonological variation. Phono means sound, right? ology, phonology is, ology is the study of, so phonology is the study of sound, right? Phonology is the study of meaningful sounds in a language. So phonological variation is the difference between sounds, right? In the way most people would say it, they'd say different accent, right? People from different countries who speak English have different accents. That's the study of phonological variation. The second type of variation, the second type of linguistic variation is lexical variation. Lexis refers to words, right? Sometimes people say, why do you say lexis? Why don't you just say words or vocabulary? Sometimes people use words just to show off and use big words. Other times, linguists use words, specialized words, because they are in fact more precise. Let's go back to phonology for a second. The phonology of a language. Why not just say the sound of a language? Well, those words are similar in meaning, phonology and sound, right? They refer to something you hear, but phonology means meaningful sounds of a language. So when I say ma, mi, mu, me, mo, those are all sounds, right? That are language sounds. Whereas knocking on the table or a cough, those are sounds, but they are not phonologically meaningful, right? So phonology is more precise than saying sound. If I'm talking to children and they say, what did you, when my daughter was young and I'd go to her school for career day and they'd say, kids would say, what did you do today? Or what's your job? And I'd say, well, today I talked about the sounds of language. Because I'm not trying to show off to those kids and use a big word like phonology. But if I'm talking to you, I'm going to use precise terms like phonology, right? Back to the second point, lexical variation. So why use lexis instead of word? Well, sometimes they mean the same thing. Sometimes we can use lexis or the word lexeme to refer to something like, in old newspapers, for example, the sport of baseball was spelt as two words, baseball. Now it's spelt as baseball. Now clearly the spelling didn't affect the meaning, or the space in this case didn't affect the meaning, right? So, in the old days, should we thought of baseball as two words? Yes, but it was one thing, right? One lexeme. Hot dog, right? A hot dog doesn't have to be hot, and we hope it's not, doesn't have anything to do with dogs. Hot dog is written as two words, but it's one lexeme in meaning, right? So lexis can be more precise than word. When it comes to when it comes to lexical variation, we're talking about differences in the way people use words, right? Sometimes we have two words that are different that refer to the same thing. A well-known one would be the sport that in some parts of the world, most parts of the world, is called football, is referred to in North America and a few other places as soccer. This is the sport where people kick the ball around with their feet, right? That's lexical variation. Do you call that thing football or do you call that thing soccer? Another way that lexical variation works is when we've got the same word that means two different things. Football, as a word, can vary in its meaning, right? For most of the world, football refers to the game where you kick a ball around and try to kick it into a net to score a goal. For some of the world, football has the meaning of sport where you, for the most part, don't use your feet, you throw the ball and try to catch it, and you wear lots of heavy padding and a big helmet, and I don't know what people call that in the rest of the world. I think they just call it American football, don't they? So lexical variation is the study of how words are used differently in different varieties of English. Number one, phonological variation. Number two, lexical variation. Number 3 and 4 are related in that they both have to do with grammar, but we can break them into two parts: syntactic variation and morphological variation. Syntactic variation has to do with syntax, which is the study of, syntax is the study of word order, right? When you take an English declarative like "it is hot" and you turn it into an English interrogative, like, is it hot? That's a syntactic change. So you've changed the word order in order to change the grammar. Morphological variation refers to changes within a word in order to change them, right? So when you say one dog, two dogs, the S on the end of two dogs changes dog to become a plural. That's a morphological change. So you can group these together as grammar, or you can be more precise and separate them into syntactic variation and morphological variation. So I think the order I put those in is similar to the order of frequency for these differences, right? I mean, accent is very noticeable, right? Phonological variation seems very common. You hear someone talking and almost instantly you will think, she's from here, he's from there, or at least, well, he's not from around here because he sounds different from people than around here, although I don't know where he's from, right? Phonological variation is very common, very noticeable. Lexical variation is also common enough, right? We go to a new place, we hear new words. You go to Australia, you'll learn all kinds of new Australian terms for things. Some of those will be for things that you don't have a word for because they don't exist in your country. Some of them will be for things that you have a word for, but the Australians have a different word. Lexical variation is quite common. Syntactic and morphological variation are possible, and we'll talk about them in more detail later. But they're not as common, and it largely seems to me that that's because if there was too much grammatical difference, too much grammatical variation, either syntactic or morphological, eventually we wouldn't know what each other was talking about, right? I mean, I like you, you like I you like, you like I. If you start switching the words around too much, in English, it would no longer be clear who was doing the liking to whom, and whether it was a question or whether it was a declarative or whether it was an imperative, even like you, I, and you might think, what, I have to like you? Something like that, right? So there certainly is grammatical variation, and we'll look at some, but for now, let's just leave it at that, right? That it exists, but it's not quite as common as the others. Now I'd like to introduce some terms that are useful for discussing that third question, what does it mean? The terms I referred to just now, previously, lexical variation, morphological variation, syntactic variation, and phonological variation, those are useful for answering the first question, what's different, right? Now you know that, back to my first example, Kant versus Kant, you'd describe that as phonological variation. For answering the third question, what does it mean? It's useful to have some terms that sociologists and sociolinguists use to discuss power relations in society. You've probably heard the term standard English and the associated term non-standard English. Now, in the newspapers and so on, standard English can be used for whatever the person writing the newspaper wants it to mean, right? Standard English is used to mean, the proper English that I and people like me speak, and not the English that people from over there speak, or people from that country, or poor people, or country, rural people. It's often used as an exercise of power to say this is the best way to speak standard English. But put that aside, right? For linguists, there's a definition that's often used from a linguist named Peter Trudgill that says that standard English is the form of English that you see in formal, written, published texts. Standard English is the type of English that you see in a newspaper. If you were to take the newspapers, the Times here in London, and the Straits Times, and the Times of India, and the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, if you took those newspapers and just read them, you would probably not be able to determine which newspaper you were reading, other, of course, than from the content. The Straits Times would have more news about about Hong Kong and China, and the Los Angeles Times would have more news about the United States. But from the English itself, from the way the words are used, from the way the grammar is used, you would probably find it hard to tell which newspaper was which, because they all tend to use standard English. We can't hear them, right? So standard English is largely used to refer to formal, written, and I say published. Treadgill's definition didn't have published English, but his definition is older. Now, of course, with people being able to write English so much, but often in texting and emailing and many, more informal situations that people write to one another, we do see a lot more variation and non-standard English in written English. But think of newspapers, think of novels, right? For the most part, they are written in standard English, and we don't know where that English is coming from. Standard English, and so non-standard English is everything else, right? English that differs from the standard, differs from, for example, textbook English. The type of English you learn in a textbook tends to be standard English. Now, of course, there are different standards. There's standards for America, standards for Australia, standards for New Zealand, and so on, right? Different countries do have different standards, but largely they're similar enough that we can refer to something as standard English, even though, and we know there's a core of standard English, even though there are some outlying features of each language that can make them differ one from another. There's with regards to answering the question 3, what does it mean? Well, often then, whether people judging varieties of English may not be using the term standard and non-standard, but often the way the judgments are made is they're judging varieties of English based on whether they think they are standard or non-standard. And standard is often seen as better, right? People around here and around London, people who speak standard English are often thought of to be more educated, to speak more prestigiously. People who speak non-standard English are often thought of to be less educated, to speak a less prestigious form of English. Now, notice I didn't say they are less educated, I said they're thought to be less educated. Speaking standard English is generally thought of as being a sign of education, and speaking non-standard English is thought of at best as being a sign of being uneducated. At worst, it's thought of as being a sign of intellectual inferiority, right? He can't, he speaks English like that, he must be stupid, right? It's common enough to hear things like that, right? That the way you use English is associated with your intelligence. Now, of course, for linguists, this is not true. This is very important. It's no easier to use one type of English than to use another. If you grow up speaking standard English, or you grow up speaking non-standard English, when you talk, you're doing the same amount of work, the same amount of mental work, the same amount of physical work in order to produce the sounds. There is no difference. So it's not a sign of intellectual laziness to speak a non-standard English. It takes just as much effort to do so. So there's got to be something else going on, right? People may say that they speak that way because they're lazy, but they're not lazy because it's not easier. So this leads to the interesting discussion of overt and covert prestige. Overt, from French ouvert, open, right? Open prestige. And covert, from like the English word covered, hidden, right? Hidden prestige. When it comes to talking about what does it mean and why do people speak differently, it's useful to think of prestige in two different ways. Not the usual just thinking of prestige as being good, honorable, like that, right? Overt prestige does mean that, right? To use language to speak in an overtly prestigious way means to speak like I hope I'm doing now, like the type of English that you read in newspapers, right? The type of English that is generally associated with education and strong social power and intelligence, right? When it comes to covert prestige, what linguists wanted to do is to have a way to talk about non-standard English without marking it all the time as inferior, or without always having to say that they speak like this, but the right way is like that, or they speak like this, but the usual way is like that. So it was clever enough of people to start using the term covert prestige, which still has that word prestige in it, and all those signals of value and goodness that we have with the word prestige, but adding covert to it to say that it's covered, a hidden type of prestige, right? Why do people choose to speak in non-standard ways? Why do people choose to speak in ways that they know other people will make fun of? Well, they speak that way because it's, to them, covertly prestigious. They feel good doing it. They're not stupid. They know that other people judge them negatively for speaking like that. Working class British people have heard the jokes about their accents. They've heard the jokes about their words. They know that other people make fun of the way they speak. But speaking with a covertly prestigious accent feels good to them. It signals to other people like them that they're part of the same group. Grandma spoke like this, the nice lady down the street speaks like that, dad speaks like this with his friends. These are good people, I love these people, so why wouldn't I talk like that? So they're speaking in a way that is prestigious to them, although it may not be considered prestigious by the wider society. So it's very useful to think of describing different language varieties as being either overtly prestigious or covertly prestigious. Many people, of course, can speak both ways. What tends to happen, unfairly of course, is that people who are raised speaking in an overtly prestigious way can speak that way all the time. At home they speak in an overtly prestigious way. When they're at school, they can continue to do the same thing. When they go to work, they can continue to do the same thing. People who are raised speaking a language variety that is covertly prestigious, as I said, unfairly, are expected to do more work. They may speak in the covertly prestigious language variety at home, but when they go to school, they're expected to change the way they talk, or especially the way they write, in order to write in an overtly prestigious way in order to do well in their studies. And when they go to work, depending on the job, of course, they may be expected to change the way they talk, especially when dealing with customers, clients, in order to signal overt prestige and all of those associations with intelligence and social power that go along with overt prestige. So like I said, it's unfair. Overtly prestigious language users just have to speak the way they always do. Covertly prestigious language users have to become bi-dialectical. They've got to learn two ways of speaking the same language depending on different situations. Now, it's not to say we don't all do this. Some of us speak more formally at some times and less formally at other times. I speak differently to you here than I do to my wife and daughter. You know, if my wife says, "How was your day?" I don't say, "I have 3 things I want to tell you first." You know, then she'd say, "Get out," right? So we change the way we talk depending on the situation, yes. But people who speak marginalized varieties of English, ones that are often covertly prestigious to their users, they're expected to change more. So to sum up, there are 3 main things I would like you to remember from today. First, the 3 questions that I asked you at the start. What's different? Why is it different? And what does it mean? Those are very useful starting points for any discussion of language variation in sociolinguistics. Second, I would like you to remember the 4 types of variation: phonological variation, lexical variation, syntactic variation, and morphological variation. Third, I would like you to remember those terms associated with the discussion of language and power: standard and non-standard English, covert prestige and overt prestige. If you've got all of those, you've got a very firm foundation for discussing sociolinguistics. Thank you.